Yes, I had the pleasure of introducing Alex Connor. He's RPI class of 2023. He is the first place winner of our combined spring competition from a year ago in 2020. He's a chemical and biological engineering PhD candidate. He won the top prize last year for his presentation on Mega Silk, which is a synthetic silk for multiple industries in need of strong, lightweight materials. So, and also hot off the presses is that Alex will be moving forward to the finals of the New York State Business Plan Competition, which was just announced in the last day. So Alex is here to tell us what he's been up to for the last year. We're very excited to see what's going on. And with that, I turn it over to Alex.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Jim. And also thank you all the teams and the judges. I watched the presentations and you all did a very great job. It's great to see that during the pandemic, the I-Corps program is still going strong and the Severino Center is still going strong. And Jim, thank you for being our team's mentor last year during our own session with the I-Corps program. Much appreciated. So as Jim mentioned, I'm an engineering student here in the chemical engineering department. Like a lot of students at RPI, especially ones here, I was interested in both science and entrepreneurship for pretty much as long as I can remember. And so that led me to where I am today, which is simultaneously doing some research and also working on turning that research into a startup. So I started the PhD program in the fall of 2018, and my research project surrounds making what's called recombinant silk. So silk is actually a protein. Silk scarf, silk kimono, any garment you can think of made of silk is actually a protein. And there's some really interesting research on how we can make this protein using bacteria instead of silkworms. And this offers a bunch of different advantages. But about a year and a half into my PhD program, the spring of 2020, is when I started the I-Corps program. So January was when I had been thinking about doing my research, turning it into a startup for a long time, and I decided now's the time. So I applied to the program, and that started the process. And I don't know if I can share my screen here. Looks like Jason is sharing. I do have just a couple of pictures.
Yeah, go ahead.
Great, thank you. And as Jim mentioned, whenever last year, or a little over a year ago, whenever I started the I-Corps program, our company name was Mega Silk. I was the only student team member. Jim was our mentor, and my two PhD advisors were also along as team members. And as you can see here, the name isn't that great. I think this is a pretty terrible name, but it was actually based off one of the bacterial species we were working with. And because we're working with silk, I threw a spider web on there, just be all cool, silk, it's cool stuff. And the next 3 months were pretty interesting for me. And being the only student, it was quite a crazy 3 months of doing all the interviews myself and meeting all these different people. And I've actually taken this slide from my presentation last year. And, one of the things I was encountering was that with a material like silk, there are so many different applications: biodegradable plastics, functional coatings, all these potential routes. So I found myself talking to people from tissue engineering space all the way to aerospace parts, and even things like functional coatings and medical devices. But ultimately, what I found through the customer discovery journey here was that there was by far the most positive response in the textiles and clothing industry for people interested in silk materials that don't come from animals. Seems pretty straightforward. We already use silk for clothing, but the difference is the silk that Mega Silk will be producing is completely animal-free. And so that's kind of what I rolled with for the final presentation. And I think part of the reason that the program went well for me and I did well in the competition is because I really just dove headfirst into this whole customer discovery process. And I was working with a material and with a product that allowed me to have such a cool journey through customer discovery and do so many different interviews. But since then, things have changed drastically. Through the fall and summer, there were two really important things that happened. The first was that the milestones that I was required to do ended up being extremely pivotal. The milestones involved me talking to more industries, working on my product development, putting together market research documents, and especially during the pandemic, this was a huge part of how the company has moved forward since then. And it was also a huge part of our rebranding about September or August, September of 2020, we completely rebranded as a new company, Ripely. And I like to think that our name and our logo is much better than before. And we're focusing on an industry I never thought we would be in, the food industry. Believe it or not, you can take silk proteins and apply them to fresh food, and it completely saves the fresh food. It can double or even triple the shelf life of fresh food. And this is a picture from an actual research paper showing that this is possible. So through the fall and the summer, we found these research papers, and we decided this was the best market for us, and we could really make an impact here. And also along this time, I started to really use some things that I learned during the I-Corps program, including expanding my team. Up until the fall, I was still a team of one. I did have my academic advisors helping me, but they weren't really as involved as I was. And I expanded the team to include two other gentlemen, Alex DeClaire and James Farbo, and applied my I-Corps skills. And what that means is doing a crazy amount of customer discovery. A ton of customer discovery. These two gentlemen did a great job of interviewing over 100 different people at this point. And similar to the problem we had a year ago, the food industry is really big and really complicated. And without the experience I had in the I-Corps program, would have never been able to make sense of it. But ultimately, we found that of all these different subsectors in the food industry, right now we're really focused on food retail and consumers. And the idea is that we're going to develop a product that is a small amount of silk protein and water, and it can be sprayed onto fresh food to double or triple the shelf life. And that's kind of the direction of our business model right now. And some more updates since the fall. After our pivot, we have had a fun time this spring, a very busy time this spring. We have been accepted and competed in several different business plan competitions, including the Cardinal Challenge and the Heartland Challenge, where we were accepted as semifinalists. And as of this morning, we actually finished first place in our track in the New York State, the regional part of the New York State Business Competition, and we will be moving on to the state finals. So it's an exciting time for us, a lot of competitions. And one other thing I would like to mention here is that these competitions, once again, just showed the importance of doing something like the I-Corps program. In the Cardinal Challenge, which was earlier, it was the first one we did this spring, the judges were actually quite critical of us and very skeptical of our consumer market. As you can see here, we identified consumers as one of our primary sectors. And the judges were quite critical of this, but this was in contrast to what we had discovered in our own customer discovery. So I came up with an idea that I don't think I ever would have come up with had it not been my experiences the past year, where we actually set up a full product stand, a full mock product stand to get out there and to, as they tell you in the program, in the I-Corps program and business model competition, get out there and talk to people and actually do it. So we made full-on concept prototype bottles of our product with labels and logos, and we set up a stand that had fruit that had gone bad as well as fresh fruit. We talked to over 50 consumers this day in a sales setting, and we took all these pictures and all these findings with us to the next competitions, and the response from the judges couldn't have been more of a 180. They were in love with our product, our idea. They told us just to focus on the consumer market. So it just goes to show the power of customer discovery when it comes to an early stage startup like this. And so, just to kind of conclude here, because, I don't want to take up too much of everyone's time, just some parting thoughts and some take-home messages. I think with programs like the I-Corps and doing these business model competitions, the things I can't stress enough that have been important for me and our business have been looking at startups through the customer discovery process, looking at startups as in find who you're going to sell to and what you're going to sell to them before you start building something. That concept was foreign to me before getting involved in this space, but it has proved to be invaluable. Also, I can't stress enough how awesome it has been to get connected with the Severino Center, Kelly, Clint, Jim, and all the great people there, and also just with the regional business community. And Kelly, Clint, and Jim, you guys have been awesome, helped me out so much. You guys got me a great presentation last fall with IndieBio, which is a biotech incubator. So, we're looking to use those connections in the future. And the program like this has also helped me learn about IP, how that works with startups, and also just milestones in general. Those milestones that I was required to set over the summer for my company were extremely pivotal in its development. And I use that technique now moving forward, both with our technical and business development. And so for the future of Ripely, we're looking at more business plan competitions throughout the late spring and summer. And we're also filing some exciting provisional patents. And we actually already have a few provisionals in place through RPI, and we're going to be turning those into full patents. And in this summer and the fall, we're going to be experimenting with some new prototypes and hopefully develop an MVP through the summer and the fall here. So thank you to everyone that's helped me along the way. And if anybody has any questions or comments, if any teams are interested in asking me anything, be more than happy to help you. And add me on LinkedIn, and we can connect or something like that. So
Alex, you really had a pretty interesting journey there. Particularly pivoting to the food industry. I mean, that's really quite a pivot. And I'm wondering, was there anything really like particularly noteworthy that led you to drive that significant pivot? Was there an aha moment? Was there a few things that just sort of culminated and you just said, all right, it's time to switch, and now we get it? Tell us a little bit more about how that pivot happened.
Yes, definitely. So silk proteins are awesome because they have so many different applications, but recombinant silk proteins can be very expensive, which means that over the summer, I kind of realized that the textiles and clothing market that I had originally honed in on wasn't really viable. The cost of production is just too high to support any considerable amount of textiles that people are going to buy. And so that led me to investigate markets that require much smaller amounts of raw material. So the start of it was actually from the technical side. And I found some of these research papers that were actually fairly recent and new, showing these food preservation capabilities using only very small amounts of the material. So that kind of started it, was the technical side. And then once I saw the possibility there is when I assembled the larger team, really dove headfirst into the business side to do the customer discovery and to see if this was actually a viable option.
Gotcha. So was it hard for you to make that change? I mean, you kind of went out there, you figured you had the world figured out and you were going to solve a bunch of problems, and now you're hearing this from the customers and you're hearing all kinds of problems with your original path. Was it hard for you to leave that behind and move in a different direction?
In some ways it was, because there was a lot of work, a lot of research documents, interviews that I had collected in that space. So there was a decent amount of work that had gone into it. But for me, it was an easy decision to make because the food industry seemed so much more viable. And once getting into it and really getting the positive feedback from the customer interviews and realizing that this is actually possible, that's when I could care less at this point about the textiles and everything like that. We're just solely focused on food, and it's best for the business, definitely. So
that mock product stand, tonight's the first time I heard about that. That was really a neat idea. I really like that. I gotta believe that just started off some really neat conversations with people, just because the way you had that little physical thing set up and you didn't just have PowerPoints in the background or posters or whatever, but anything you can touch and feel and, squirting stuff on fruit. Come on, what's better than that?
We had no idea leading up to it what it was going to be like, if it was going to work. We thought it was going to be totally hit or miss, but it ended up working out greatly. So just the 180 and how the judges felt, like you said, them being able to see me holding a bottle, us out there actually at a product stand with customers, even though it wasn't an actual product yet, and even though we weren't actually selling anything yet, it went so far towards how they viewed us as a company and the type of feedback they gave us. And it also went so far for us in terms of like really settling down on a price point, getting people's candid response to this in a sales setting. Customer discovery interviews are great when you call up consumers and you ask them things, but it's a very different setting when they think that you're going to sell them something and they see what they think is a real product with real benefits and whatnot. So,
Num4, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. I was curious where your consumer solution would actually be purchased. Like, is it something that is near the grocery aisles when you go to Walmart or something like that, or is it something you order off Amazon?
it's a great question, and this is something we've talked about in our business plans that we've submitted for competitions. We play around with the idea of having an indirect model towards consumers, or at least partially, where it's like on the aisles of retail or food stores. You know, you walk down the produce section, you see a bottle of it. But honestly, the judges' feedback that we've gotten, and also kind of our own gut feeling, is just to go direct to consumer with e-commerce sales, targeted cheap advertising on YouTube and whatnot. At this point, we have a pretty good idea of who some of our early adopters might be, and we think just the best way to get to them is to do what most other people are doing right now, just sell things online. So that, I think that's going to be what we end up doing when we ultimately launch products.
So I just got to jump in on the one part of what you said there about finding those early adopters first. I mean, that's the key to, you know, a startup getting out into the real world, is find those people who are willing to plunk the money down on something to solve a problem that they have right now, and not worry about getting to the mass market, you know, immediately, solve everybody's problems right away. But who are those ones that really have the hair on fire problem you can get to first, and focus on them and think about how you're going to get to them.
Yeah. If anybody has questions, not necessarily about my company or my business, but just in general, moving forward from the I-Corps program, and you know, some of the experiences I have with things like IP, or moving forward into other business plan competitions, what those are like. If you have any questions about your own business or things like that, I'd be more than happy to throw in my 2 cents.
I'm wondering if you could tell us just a little bit more about, you know, what did you learn in the last year or so about intellectual property that you know, you didn't know before?
Uh, Quite a bit. Pretty. It was at about 1% of my knowledge about a year ago. So it's interesting being in the university environment, because it's kind of a double-edged sword. You know, I think everybody here is an RPI student, if I'm not mistaken. So any IP that you develop at RPI that uses any of RPI's resources is owned by RPI. So what that means is that, in my case, I'm a researcher. Any technologies I work on that we patent through RPI, if I want to use that for a startup, I have to license that technology from RPI. Unless RPI deems it to be kind of a useless piece of IP, and then they might just give it to me in some other agreement. But usually you'd have to license it. And so that's kind of where I think these experiences with business model competitions, business plan competitions come into play, because what you would have to bring the IP office is proof that you and your team are able to take this IP and turn it into a business, proof that they shouldn't just sell or license this IP to a huge company, you know, for a high rate. You know, proof that as a startup, you're actually the one that can make it work better than a big company or something like that. I named some of the downsides of going through RPI, because you do have to license, you don't own it. But one of the bonuses is they do pay for it for the most part. The tech transfer office at RPI, I've worked with them now twice for 2 different provisional patents. And I can honestly say it's been a pretty pleasant experience, and they have been very helpful. So they do a lot of the legwork with putting the applications together and whatnot, which can be kind of a nightmare if you're not a lawyer. So specifically if you're not a patent lawyer.
Gotcha.
It's also, I'm sure this is something that pretty much everyone here might already know, but in moving on to the larger business plan competitions outside of the I-Corps one the past year, IP is typically very central to all of the judges' questions. For those of you that will be moving on to bigger competitions with your companies, or maybe you already have, pretty much every judge in every competition has asked us the situation with our IP. They've been very concerned with, you know, what's protecting somebody in a different country from just using this or stealing this, questions like that. So be prepared if you're ever sitting down with, in that type of competition setting, or with real VCs or something like that. Just be really prepared to answer your IP questions, because that's some stuff that's caught us a little bit off guard earlier in our corporate development.
Good advice. Can you tell us a little bit more about the difference in the customer discovery you were able to do a year ago, or more than a year ago, before the shutdown, and what it's been like in trying to talk to people now under the restrictions of the COVID-19 pandemic?
For the food industry, what I will say is that contacting the retail sector, people kind of more like the farm production end of things earlier in the supply chain, not a whole lot has changed, because so much of that pretty much happens over the phone, and it was going to happen over the phone or over Skype anyway before that, because a lot of these people we're contacting are not necessarily in Albany or Troy. The whole consumer side, though, I think is a little bit different. I think that I think that there's a huge difference when it comes to phone interviews with like retail people versus consumers. Just our own experience with the consumer sector is like people over the phone aren't going to give the same answer as if they walked up to the product stand. And that was a striking difference. There were some serious overlaps. It was actually pretty interesting that the percentage of people we talked to over the phone that would be interested in buying it was actually pretty similar to what was in person. But the other types of feedback we got were things that I feel like you couldn't get over the phone. People interacting with it, people being more frank about the price point because they thought it was something being sold to them. So consumers, it's definitely changed during the pandemic, but I think that, fortunately for us, we were able to find something that was outdoors, that was still happening in person. So those opportunities are harder to come by.
I did want to ask you one question about, you talked about the customer discovery process, and doing all this early learning, because it doesn't cost you a whole lot of money to talk to people. If you had gone down the original path of MegaSilk without having, done some of this customer discovery first, and were you maybe in the absence of that down a path where you would have started building prototypes, you would have started incurring costs to go down a path that you now have abandoned, and it would have been a very different experience for you had you not gone through the customer discovery process? And what do you think that might have been like?
I think that's partially true, but also the caveat is I was starting out in a place. I think a lot of the other teams I was competing with had a better idea of what their product was. I was literally starting from square, like from zero, like from nowhere. I had no idea what the product might be other than that it was going to be recombinant soap based, and I had no idea what industry. But then moving forward from there, I do think that had it not been for continued customer discovery, there could have been some costs incurred. At one point in the summer, we were starting to drift away from textiles, but starting to think about cosmetics. Silk proteins are actually used in cosmetics and in very small amounts. So we were thinking that could be potentially a viable industry from the technical side, especially. And then kind of where the experience with I-Core comes into play is that technically it worked out, but we started doing customer discovery in the cosmetics and we started doing market research into cosmetics, and just we could not come up with a value proposition. We couldn't come up with where recombinant silk would have any benefit outside of just much cheaper bio-based materials and things of that nature. And kind of the nail in the coffin was when I actually contacted a company that does make recombinant silk, and they did try to launch a cosmetic product. And I talked to them and they told me they were discontinuing it because effectively what she said was that they had no value proposition. She didn't word it that way, but that's what I got out of it. They really weren't bringing any new value. So had I not done that in the fall, instead of focusing on food, I could have been spending money on prototype cosmetics or things of that nature. So that's very, very true. Something could have happened like that.
Gotcha. Great. Some great experiences to share with us here tonight.